Okay. Thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate it. We're going to be going over a recap, and those who couldn't make today can, I guess, always watch the video. Okay. I'm going to just recap over what we had already read. I don't know if you did any additional reading, but we were talking about the different stages of children when they're growing up and what that actually is like in each part of those phases that they experience, particularly with the hatching and the practicing. Which hatching was mommy and me aren't the same. Practicing was I can do anything. And then rapprochement was I can't do everything. And we also talked about how children need to be able to learn that the words like mine, my, and me aren't swear words or bad words. The boundary that we discussed was one of the most important, was the one word boundary, which is no. And how at that age toddlers tend to become no addicts, and there are some parents who do not accept this as a legitimate answer from their children, and they, instead of welcoming it and appreciating it, especially for what it will mean for the child later on in life. When the child is a toddler, some parents, fathers or mothers, they do not accept the word no, and they make the child feel bad about expressing this. And later on, we become yes people pleasers, and afraid to step out of the norm, and afraid to step out into our own personalities, even preferring to be chameleon-like instead of what it means to be a man in society or a woman in society, instead of using proper boundaries where and when are necessary. We also covered that parents need to be able to set and keep age-appropriate boundaries with children, meaning not giving in to temper tantrums, etc., even though it might have less humiliation attached to it at the time. It actually does not benefit us or the child when we are the child. And also we covered that is the last that we covered. So we'll be going on to talk about that particular portion. It's worth it for children to have their no. It keeps them from feeling completely helpless and powerless. Parents have two tasks associated with no. First, they need to help their child feel safe enough to say no, thereby encouraging his or her own boundaries. Though they certainly can't make all the choices they'd like, young children should be able to have a no that is listened to. Informed parents won't be insulted or enraged by their child's insistence or resistance. They will help the child to feel that his no is just as lovable as his yes. And many of us in abusive situations in childhood, we did not feel that our no was just as lovable as our yes. In fact, we felt almost forced to say yes instead of having our no respected, or we had physical punishment and retribution for saying no, especially in situations of sexual abuse and emotional abuse and gaslighting, name calling that we were exposed to as a child, and all these kinds of things. If we were to say, do not call me that or stop calling me that, our no was invalidated, right? These help the child to feel that his no is just as lovable as his yes. They won't withdraw emotionally from a child who says no, but will stay connected. One parent must often support another who is being worn down by their baby's no, and this process takes work. One couple was faced with an aunt whose feelings were hurt by her daughter's refusal to kiss and hug her upon every visit. Sometimes the child wanted to be close. Sometimes she wanted to stand back and simply watch. The couple responded to the aunt's complaint saying, "We don't want Casey to feel that her affection is something she owes people. We'd like her to be in charge of her life." These parents wanted their daughter's yes to be yes, and her no to be no, and both to be respected. They wanted her to be able to say no so that in the future she would have the ability to say no to evil. And what does evil look like in our lives? Evil can look like basically allowing people to walk all over us, or allowing people to engage in behaviors that we don't like, but we don't say no to those people. Instead, we avoid conflict, or we try to people please, or we simply allow it and justify that the behavior is happening because of something we did, victim blaming, etc., and self-victimizing. The second task facing parents of children in the rapprochement stage is that helping the child respect others' boundaries. So, you will often hear me say in streams, advice streams particularly, as well as throughout this reading, that one of the reasons that we have difficulty respecting others' boundaries is because our boundaries were not respected. And so we basically don't know or are unable to recognize the boundaries of others. And the reason for that is that our own boundaries were not built and were not respected, or even taught in some cases. Children need to be able to not only give a no, but also to take a no. Parents need to be able to set and keep age-appropriate boundaries with children. It means not giving in to temper tantrums at the shop, though it would be less humiliating to quiet the child. It means timeouts, appropriate confrontations, and spanking when necessary. Discipline your son for that, in that there is hope. Do not be a willing party to his death. In other words, help your child to learn to take limits before it's too late. Boundary construction is most evident in 3-year-olds. By this time, they should have mastered the following tasks: the ability to be emotionally attached to others, yet without giving up a sense of self and one's freedom to be apart. The ability to say appropriate no's to others without a fear of loss of love. The ability to take appropriate no's from others without withdrawing emotionally. Noting these tasks, a friend said, half joking, "They need to learn this by age 3? How about by age 43? Yes, these are tall orders, but boundary development is essential in the early years of life. Many of us have not had boundary development, and so in this time, our adulthood is the time where we can engage in starting to learn some of those boundary developments and expressing our no and becoming comfortable with that is part of that. Sometimes those early no's are going to very much resemble the toddler saying no, and the reason is we've never been able to express them before. 2 additional periods of life focus on boundaries. The first is adolescence. The adolescent years are a reenactment of the first years of life. They involve more mature issues such as sexuality, gender identity, competition, and adult identity. But the same issues of knowing when to say yes and no and to whom are central during this confusing time. The second period is young adulthood, the time when children leave home or college and start a career or get married. Young adults suffer a loss of structure during this period. There are no class bells, no schedules imposed by others, as well as the demands of intimacy and commitment. This can often become an intense time of learning more about setting good boundaries. The earlier the child learns good boundaries, the less turmoil he or she experiences later on in life. A successful first 3 years of life will mean a smoother, but not smooth, adolescence and a better transition into adulthood. A problematic childhood can be helped by lots of hard work in the family during adolescence, but serious boundary problems during both these periods will be devastating during the adult years. Just by reading that, I'm sure you can recognize in your own situation and in your own upbringing where or how this path may have gone wrong for you, as well as how this path could lead you to be attracted to others who suffer from the same experience themselves, and therefore subconsciously allow you to repeat a pattern. Can you see that? Yeah. And we will be attracted to others who do not have boundaries if we ourselves have not learned how to have boundaries. Or we will be attracted to people who repeatedly step on our boundaries, especially if we have been invalidated in childhood. And you can see the reason for that in just learning about adolescence as well as those early formative years. It helps to know the way it should have been for me, said one woman who attended a talk on child development. What would really help me to know is what went wrong for me. Next, we will look at where our boundary development can go wrong. Boundary injuries. What goes wrong? Boundary problems are rooted in thousands of encounters with others, as well as in our own nature and personality. The most important boundary conflicts, however, occur in the first few years, crucial years of life. They may happen in any or all of the 3 phases of separation and individuation with parents: hatching, practicing, or rapprochement, which we went over in the previous session. Generally, the earlier and more severe the injury, the deeper the boundary problem will be. Withdrawal from boundaries. I don't know why, but it happens, mused Ingrid over coffee with her friend Alice. Every time I disagree with my mother, even on little things, I feel a terrible sense that she's not there anymore. It's like she's hurt and withdrawn and I can't get her back. It's really a terrible feeling to think you've lost someone you love. Let's be honest, no one enjoys being told no. It's difficult to accept another person's refusal to give support or to be intimate or to forgive. Yet good relationships are built on the freedom to confront and to refuse. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another, the Bible recommends. Not only good relationships, but also mature characters are built on appropriate no's. Developing children need to learn and know that their boundaries will be honored. It is crucial that their disagreements, their practicing, I'll say that again. It is crucial that their disagreements, their practicing, their experimentation not result in a withdrawal of love. Please don't misunderstand this. Personal limits are crucial. Children need to know behavioral lines that should not be crossed. They need to suffer biblical, age-appropriate consequences for acting out. In fact, when parents do not set and maintain good boundaries with their children, the children suffer another type of boundary injury, which we will discuss shortly. What What we're talking about here isn't allowing the child free rein. Parents need to stay attached and connected to their children even when they disagree with them. That doesn't mean they shouldn't get angry. It means they shouldn't withdraw. How often do we hear the statement that God loves the sinner but hates the sin? This is true. His love is constant and never fails. When parents detach from a misbehaving young child instead of staying connected and dealing with the problem, God's constant love is then misrepresented. When parents pull away in hurt, disappointment, or passive rage, they are sending the message to the youngster, you're lovable only when you behave. You aren't lovable when you don't behave. You got a lot out of that? Oh, that's good. I'm glad. Yeah, this is a very heavy but important chapter. Yes, me too. I got a lot of that behavior when I was younger as well. And many of us who end up having boundary problems, we did, which is what they're exactly describing, so that we can see the connection between the two. Put yourself now in the child's place. The child translates the message to something like, when I'm good, I'm loved. When I'm bad, I am cut off. So what would you do? It's not a difficult decision as a child. God created people with a need for attachment and relationship. Parents who pull away from their child are, in essence, practicing spiritual and emotional blackmail. The child can either now pretend to not disagree and keep the relationship, or he can continue to separate and lose his most important relationship in the world. So, he or she will most likely keep quiet or keep hidden. Children whose parents withdraw when they start setting limits learn to accentuate and develop a compliant, loving, sensitive part. At the same time, they learn to fear, distrust, and hate their aggressive, truth-telling, and separate parts. If someone they love pulls away when they become angry, cantankerous, or experimental, children will learn to hide these parts of themselves. Parents who tell their children, it hurts us when you're angry, make the child responsible for emotional health of the parent. Sometimes at 2 or 3 years old. It's far, far better to say, I know you're angry, but you still can't have that toy. And then to take your hurt feelings to a spouse, a friend, or to the Lord. That's okay, Mr. J. Welcome in. Good to see you again. By nature, children are feeling omnipotent. They live in a world where the sun shines because they were good, and it rains because they were naughty. Children will give up this omnipotence gradually over time as they learn that needs and events besides theirs are important. Many of us know people who, even long after childhood, are still out there thinking that their needs are the only ones that are important, right? That their needs are the only ones that exist. That development part of hatching, practicing, and rapprochement did not happen for those individuals. And they would have to literally relive those experiences, as we are doing. Oh, I'm muted. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yikes. Sorry, I meant to not mute myself, but to mute you guys in case you were talking, because I don't have headphones at the moment and I cannot hear. So I will repeat that entire part. Parents who tell their children, "It hurts us when you're angry," make the child responsible for the emotional health of the parent. In effect, the child has just been made the parent of the parent, sometimes at 2 or 3 years old. It is then far better to say, "I know you're angry, but you still can't have that toy." And then to take your hurt feelings to a spouse, a friend, or the Lord as the parent. By nature, children are omnipotent. They live in a world where the sun shines because they were good, and it rains because they were naughty. Children will give up this omnipotence gradually over time, as they learn that needs and events besides theirs are important. But during the early years, this omnipotence plays right into boundary injury. When children feel parents withdrawing, they readily believe that they are the ones responsible for mom and dad's feelings. This also leads us later in life to feel that we are responsible for our mate's feelings and behaviors, for our boss's actions and words, right? This carries on if it's never examined and we don't do this boundary work. If it is never looked at, then we will continue to believe that we are responsible for all of these things that other people are very likely responsible for, but we never learned that. So, since when we were young, we readily believed that we were responsible for mom and dad's feelings, we assume that that's the case throughout the rest of our lives, don't we? That's what omnipotent means. I am powerful enough to make mom and dad pull away, so I'd better watch it. A parent's emotional withdrawal can be subtle. A hurt tone of voice, long silences suddenly for no reason, or it can be overt, crying spells, illness, yelling. Children of parents like these grow up to be adults who are terrified that setting boundaries will cause them isolation and resentment, severe isolation and severe abandonment, hostility against boundaries. Do I understand why I can't say no? Larry chuckled. Why don't you ask me a hard one? I grew up in the military. Dad's word was law, and disagreeing was always considered rebellion. I contradicted him once when I was 9. All I remember is waking up on the other side of the room with a whopping headache and a lot of hurt feelings. The second boundary injury, easier to spot than the first, is a parent's complete hostility against boundaries. The parent becomes angry at the child's attempt to separate from him or her. Hostility can then emerge in the form of angry words, physical punishment, or inappropriate consequences. Some parents will say to the child, "You'll do what I say." This is fair enough. God meant for parents to be in charge of children. But then they'll say, "And you'll like doing it." This, however, makes the child crazy, because it is a denial of the separateness and the separate soul of the child. To quote-unquote make the child like it is to pressure the child into becoming a people pleaser, not a God pleaser. Does that make sense to you guys so far? Can you recognize some of these types of situations in your own early life? Yeah, me too. Me too. When I read this, I recognized a lot of things. And it is good that it is painful, but it is also good in the long term that we do recognize these things. Because this book takes us, to those places and delivers us out of those places using the awareness that we find. If we can understand, well, my parents were this way and therefore I started believing this, then with our adult mind we can re-examine that time and we can change what we actually believed about that time and about ourselves as a substitute. We can then, with awareness, well, I originally used to believe this, but now I know this. We can then replace not only our own behaviors with others, but we can replace and make new choices about how we will speak to others and what we are willing to accept from others. If we are willing to continue to be a people pleaser or not, right? Without knowing this, we'll still just be a people pleaser and really not know why. Does that make sense? That's why I wanted to study this with you guys, is so that we can be free of those patterns. And the only way to become free of those patterns is by learning what they are, where they came from, and then reviewing them with adult eyes, new eyes of wisdom. Mr. J says, kind of makes me realize adults using things like Santa and the Easter Bunny and whatnot to control their kids. Yes, that's a great point, Mr. J. Be good or else, right? You'll do what I say and you'll like it. This do what I say is relevant, obviously, because we should listen to our parents. And you guys now as adults who can imagine having children can understand why the listening to your parents part is important, right? But not unreasonable requests, and definitely not liking it, because that takes us away from our soul of ourselves. It takes our choice away. That takes our validation of the fact that, hey, yeah, we're doing it, but we don't have to like it, right? I choose to do this for you, but I don't have to like doing it. Oftentimes as children, we didn't get that. We were robbed of that, especially in abusive households. Especially there. Some parents will criticize the boundaries of their children. If you disagree with me, I'll ... You'll do it my way or else. Don't question your mother. Or don't question your father, right? How many times have we heard these? You need an attitude readjustment. You've got no reason to feel bad, right? Many times when we have felt bad or we were suffering from some injury, whether it was outside or inside our homes, we were invalidated in that injury by hearing things like this. We were made crazy, in a sense, gaslighting. We know now as an adult term, we were gaslighted into believing that we should be okay with these things. And so this then becomes a pattern for us. When we go to school, when we're in high school, when we're choosing a college, when we're going to find a job, right? We wonder why, as children of abuse, we grow up in a household a certain way, and then our job is similar. We find a boss that is abusive, and we wonder, deep down we wonder, not day after day because we're already used to it, but deep down we wonder, why is my boss like this? Other people don't have this type of boss. Well, the reason why other people don't have that boss and you do is other people wouldn't accept that. You do because of your core belief, because of your specific upbringing. You have been taught since childhood that this is an acceptable response, right? That you are responsible for the feelings of mom and dad, as we read before. So you will also think that you are responsible for the actions of boss XYZ. You will also think you're responsible for the feelings of boss XYZ from day to day, and that relationship dynamic feeds into the relationship dynamic you have with boss or a coworker, etc., who is simply likened to, in your mind, in your subconscious, to that parental figure. We do this. You guys may not notice this, but I did, especially after reading this book. And I found my freedom after reading this book in recognizing, wow, this does happen at my job. This is why all my bosses have been abusive. Because other people wouldn't keep working for that person. Other people would be like, you know what, there is no amount of money that is acceptable for me to accept being continuing, especially for me, I saw it as continuing to be abused because I already was abused. And now I knew it. Now I had a name for these suicidal feelings. Now I had a name for why the fuck I was depressed. I didn't need medication. I needed to learn how to take out toxic people from my life. I needed to have the strength to rebuild my life and reparent myself. Medication doesn't take that stuff away. And when I talk to people and they're like, oh, I'm depressed, and then I ask them about their life, I know exactly why they're depressed. It's obvious that they should be depressed. Anyone would be depressed in those situations. But they look to medication to remove them, from that depression, when in actuality, those feelings comes from our childhood, our upbringing, and then repeating those patterns throughout our lives, so that it seems so ingrained that, oh, I just deserve all of this. I'm just not good enough, and I never will be. We come to believe these things not because they're true, but because all we have experienced has been reinforcements of what we already believed as a child. Does that make sense? I may not be saying it clear, but you were suicidal today. Yeah, I can recognize that. And the great thing is that you know your inner monologue. So as you work through boundaries, as you keep working with your life coach, and as you keep talking with your therapist about those difficult times, and start to recognize that you have these quote-unquote tapes, as Tony Robbins likes to call them, these tapes that continuously play from your childhood, you can recognize this is that tape. I often have an experience and then I go back to this tape. You can actually change that tape. And I know that because I am living proof of that. I'm literally, someone who's worked through this book twice even, and had enough life experiences since this book and before this book to be able to tell the difference. I know my tape as well. And I know that that's your tape because I had that tape too. I'm not good enough. I'm not worth it. What's wrong with me? Right? Why am I not good enough? There is no reason that you're not good enough. You are good enough. You simply have not been raised to believe that, because your tapes were created when you were in those crucial years. Does that make sense, Mr. J? Yeah, it's true and it is unfortunate. But one thing is, and I always say this here, you guys will hear me in workshop, is that you are not alone. You can go through those tapes, you can express those tapes with each other. And if you don't feel comfortable with women, which I totally respect because of the things you went through with your mom, that's okay. We can have you speaking to someone else who's not a woman, who will still be able to empower you in that way. And currently, yeah. And the thing is, these thoughts come from experiences that you have had with your mom, with withdrawal, with punishment. And they made you think those things as a child. But if you think of your own children, or you as a child, would you tell your child he's not good enough? I don't think you would. When you treat yourself as if you were another child, you can recognize the pain of your own that you're going through, Mr. J. This work, which is called inner child work, yes, it is not always necessarily words that show us that in those years. It can be anything, as we just read. It could be our parents yelling. It could be them stepping away from us. It could be every time we do a specific thing, our parent starts crying. Right? All of those things will reinforce that belief because we are only a child. We don't know any better. We assume every feeling, every action we do dictates mom and dad's feelings. And that's not true. But we believe that as children. And when we express our early boundaries, if they are not respected or they're pushed back on, we will believe, something's wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm only worthy to mom when I do XYZ. Or I'm only good to dad when I'm doing XYZ. And we carry that throughout our lives. It's infuriating to realize the extent of gaslighting and abuse I went through when I was younger and how long it took me to even realize it. Yeah, and the thing is, many people, if they didn't come to my workshop or if they didn't come to my stream or even see my video, I recognize they still don't realize it. There's so many people out there who still don't realize it. And so for some people, they're past the point. They not only do they not want to realize it, not only do they not realize it, but they don't want to realize it. Even when you try to show them, however gently, they still prefer to remain in denial. And our parents are a perfect example of that. Regardless of what we might say to them, they still will not realize that they were abused as children. They still will not recognize that they also did the same to us. And there is nothing to change them. We simply need to learn to empower ourselves because we don't control them. We only control ourselves. And as adults, although we didn't when we were children, as adults we can control what we will now accept and what we will not accept, what we will continue to tell ourselves and what we will not continue to tell ourselves. But you cannot do that without awareness. Even today I talked to my mom, she's still trying to dictate my life. Yeah, she has never let go of that sense of control over you. But as you get stronger in your boundaries, Mr. J, you will be able to make her recognize that she's going to need to let go. But right now, you don't have to be at that place. That's later, that's many steps away. In the last meeting we had, I was talking about, Psycho Kensho being step 1 of the 237 steps. That's at the 237 steps. That's not at, step 1, which is where we are today. And I'll go on reading. Children need to be under the authority and control of their parents, but when parents punish their child for his or her growing independence, he will usually retreat into hurt and resentment. This hostility is a poor counterfeit of God's program of learning discipline. Discipline is the art of teaching children self-control by using consequences. Irresponsible actions should cause a discomfort that motivates us to become more responsible. The my way or else approach teaches children to pretend to be obedient, at least when the parent is in earshot. The you have a choice approach teaches children to be responsible for their own actions. Instead of saying, you'll make your bed or you'll be grounded for a month, the parent can say, you have a choice. Make your bed and I'll let you play Nintendo. Don't make your bed and you'll lose your Nintendo privileges for the rest of the day. The child now can decide how much pain he or she is willing to endure to be disobedient. God disciplines, teaches us, not punishes us. God disciplines us for our own good, that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Many of us think of the word discipline and we're triggered because what we were told was discipline was abusive punishment, excessive punishment, excessive behaviors called discipline. But discipline using consequences, which we will also learn to use with others. And I promise you this because I learned that from this book. Using discipline as consequence, natural consequences sometimes, to bad behaviors, teaches children that they have a choice. They have a choice in choosing. So then, when we as adults offer other adults the choice of having the consequence of their behavior, we then are teaching them boundaries as well as respecting our own. Can you see how that can come about for you guys? Yes, I can repeat that. So, throughout this book, we will learn how to use the idea of you have a choice instead of the my way or else way that our parents taught us. You have a choice is expressing consequences for bad behavior. We too, as adults, can put consequences on other adults, thereby expressing our own boundaries, meaning respecting our no, and empowering them to make a choice as well, to allow them the natural consequences of their bad behaviors towards us. Learning how to use consequences will empower us in using our boundaries, and as a sort of side effect, it also empowers them because it will teach them that they too can use boundaries with others in their life who have been maybe invalidating them. Does that make sense? When parents greet their children's disagreement, disobedience, or practicing with simple hostility, the children are denied the benefit of being trained. They don't learn that delaying gratification and being responsible has benefits. Many of us may suffer with issues of self-control. I know I used to, and maybe you guys do too. If you ever wondered where that issue of self-control or why you don't know how to delay your gratification many times, or express self-control in other areas that you need to, this is it. This is why. You now understand the answer. And it's not simple. It was reinforced over years and years and years of being greeted with disagreement, hostility, and more. The children are denied the benefit of being trained. They don't learn that delaying gratification and being responsible have benefits. They only learn how to avoid someone's wrath. Ever wonder why some Christians fear an angry God no matter how much they read about His love in the Bible? I was one of those. I believed all those things about God. Oh, God is angry with me, and I'm not going to ever meet His high standards, right? Even though God doesn't say any of those things in the Bible. Any of the things that I believed about this angry God, punishing God, that's not the God I encountered at all, especially after reading this book. The thing that we do as children, especially if we are very young and we don't understand even the concept of God yet, but our parents supposedly teach us about God, is we hoist on our beliefs about our parents, about pleasing our parents, and about their controlling nature to God. We assume, well, God must be that way also. And this is a huge mistaken identity case, because that is not true. It's not true at all. The results of this hostility are difficult to see because these children quickly learn how to hide under a compliant smile. When these children grow up, they suffer depression, anxiety, relationship conflicts, and substance abuse problems. For the first time in their lives, many boundary-injured individuals even realize they have a problem. Hostility can create problems in both saying and hearing no. Some children become pliably enmeshed with others, but some react outwardly and become controlling people, just like the hostile parent. The Bible addresses two distinct reactions to hostility. Its parents. Fathers are told not to embitter their children or they will become discouraged. Some children respond to this harshness with compliance and depression. At the same time, fathers are told to not exasperate their children. Other children react to hostility with rage. Many grow up to be just like the hostile parent who hurt them. Over-control. Over-control occurs when the otherwise loving parents try to protect their children from making mistakes by having too strict rules and limits on them. For example, they may keep their children from playing with other kids to protect them from being hurt or learning bad habits. They may be so concerned about their children catching a cold that they may make them wear galoshes on a cloudy day. The problem with over-control is this. While a major responsibility of good parents is certainly to control and protect, they must allow and make room for their children to make mistakes. Remember that we learn maturity by constant use, as it says in the Bible. Over-controlled children, however, are subject to dependency, enmeshment conflicts, and difficulty setting and keeping firm boundaries. They also have problems taking risks and truly being creative. Lack of limits. Eileen sighed. Her husband Bruce was in his twice-a-week mode of throwing a fit whenever she dropped the ball, quote-unquote. This time he was yelling about having to reschedule their night out with the Billings. Eileen had forgotten to call a babysitter for the kids until 4 that afternoon. She couldn't understand why Bruce gets so wound up about such little things. Maybe he just needs time off. That was it. Eileen brightened up. We need a vacation. She forgot that they'd had one a month ago. Eileen had very loving but indulgent parents. They couldn't stand to make her ever do anything or to discipline her with any timeouts or consequences or spankings. her folks thought that lots and lots of love and forgiveness will help her to become the adult she needs to be. So whenever Eileen didn't pick up after herself, her mother would cover for her. When she wrecked the family car 3 times, Eileen's dad got her her own car. And when she overdrew her checking account, her parents quietly put more money into it. After all, isn't love patient, they'd say to themselves? Eileen's parents lack limits on her hurt and her character development. Though she was a loving wife, mother, and worker, others were constantly frustrated at her undisciplined and careless way of living. It cost others a lot to be in a relationship with Eileen, yet she was so lovable that most of her friends didn't want to hurt her feelings by confronting her. So the problem remains unsolved. Can you guys recognize a pattern here where Eileen's parents and Eileen's friends are similar? They treat her similarly. Why would Eileen choose to be friends specifically with people like that? Because obviously we're adults now. We choose our friends. We don't have to just be friends with whoever decides to friend us. We are attracted to certain types of people. So why do we think Eileen, exactly, she'll gravitate to that? Because that's how her parents were with her. And likewise, if her parents were another way, overly critical or over controlling, then what kind of a wonder would it be that she also has a mate that is the same way, a boss and co-worker that she's close to that is the same way, and so on and so on and so on, right? Because we will gravitate to what we know, what we understand. We will not gravitate towards... Sigmund Freud didn't mean we'll date our parents in a sexual... Yes, I totally agree with that. I am not a fan of Freud's theories, but that particular one I have found to be true over and over and over and over again. I wouldn't say it's fact, but it is a wonderful theory, and I strongly believe in that theory. It has nothing to do with dating our parents in a sexual manner. It is very much us being attracted to what we have already known. And that serves to toxically and unhealthily cause attachments that are also toxic and abusive for many of us. But recognizing that is not something everyone is able to do or ready to do psychologically. It's tough. It's hard work, as you guys know, as you guys are seeing right now. All the relationships you have had, close ones, meaningful ones, imagine that they were all psychologically, subconsciously taking the place of that early relationship that you could not fix. That early relationship that you are attracted to subconsciously for a reason, because you have been through that and that is all you know, is that dynamic of quote-unquote love. I'll go on. Lack of parental boundaries is the opposite of hostility. Again, biblical discipline would have provided necessary structure to help Eileen develop her character. Sometimes a lack of parental limits coupled with a lack of connection can produce an aggressively controlling person. We all know the experience of going into a supermarket, observing a 4-year-old in total control of the parent. The parent begs, pleads, and threatens the son or daughter to stop having his or her tantrum. Then, at their wits' end, they give him or her the candy they've been screaming for. But that's the last one, they say, struggling for some sense of control over the child. But by then, control is an illusion. Now imagine that 4-year-old as a 40-year-old man or woman. The scenario has changed, but the script remains the same. When he is crossed, or she, when someone sets a limit with him or her, the same tantrum erupts. And by then, they've had 36 more years of having the world cater to them. His or her recovery program will need to be very strong and consistent in order to help them. Sometimes recovery comes in the form of hospitalization. Sometimes it comes in the form of divorce or breakup. Sometimes recovery comes in the form of jail time. And sometimes it comes in disease and illness. But no one can really escape the disciplines of life. They will always win out. We will always reap what we sow. And the later in life it is, the sadder a picture it is. For the stakes are so much higher, aren't they? Obviously, we're describing the person who has a difficult time hearing others' boundaries and needs. These people have been as injured by a lack of boundaries as others have been by too rigid boundaries, inconsistent limits. Sometimes due to their confusion about rearing children and their own injuries parents faced, some parents combine strict and lax limits, sending totally conflicting messages to children. The children don't know what the rules of the family or life are. Alcoholic families exhibit this inconsistent limit. Children don't know what the rules of family and life are. A parent may be loving and kind one day, totally unreasonably harsh the next. This particularly true because of the behavior changes brought on by drinking and drug addiction. Alcoholism and addiction causes massive boundary confusions in the child and in the family. Adult children of alcoholics never feel safe in a relationship. They're always waiting for the other person to let them down or maybe attack them unexpectedly. They keep their guard up constantly. Setting limits is traumatic for adult children of alcoholics. Saying no might bring respect. Saying no might bring on rage or punishment. They feel like the double-minded person described in James 1:6, like the wave of the sea blown about and tossed by the wind. They are always uncertain about what they are and aren't responsible for. Trauma. Up until now, we've dealt with characteristics of family relating. Withdrawal, hostility, and setting inappropriate limits are ways parents act toward their children. Over time, these become ingrained in the soul of the child. In addition, specific traumas can injure boundary development. A trauma is an intensely painful emotional experience, rather a character pattern. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are all traumatic. Accidents and debilitating illnesses are traumatic. Severe losses such as the death of a parent, a divorce, or extreme financial hardship are traumatic. A good way to look at the difference between character-relating problems such as withdrawal and hostility and trauma is to look at how a tree in a forest can be hurt. It can be fed inappropriately through bad ingredients in the soil, or it can be given too much or too little sun, or too much or too little water. That's an illustration of character pattern problems. Trauma, however, is lightning hitting the tree. A trauma can affect a boundary development because it shakes up the two necessary foundations to any child's growth. 1. The world is reasonably safe. 2. They have control over their own little lives. Children who undergo trauma feel these foundations shaken up. They become unsure that they are safe and protected in the world, and they become frightened that they have no say-so in any danger that approaches them. So after what I just covered, and now recognizing the two foundations of your childhood and the childhood of others, as well as your parents, if they were shaken up by trauma, how these beliefs from childhood, core beliefs, which we discussed in chapter 1, affect you in your every single day and every single choice without wisdom. without examining them, without understanding where they came from. You can see here how the child of trauma, they become unsure that they are safe and protected in the world. Therefore, these children do not trust anyone. And they become frightened that they have no say-so in any danger that approaches them. That can be somebody lying to them. That could be someone physically abusing them in school or bullying them. That can be taking the forms of so many things that are boundary violations. And children of trauma, we allow that. Well, not me anymore, but we have allowed that, right? Up to the point where we become aware that the reason we're allowing it, it goes back to this. This is why we believed that. This is why we allowed that. And this frees us in a way to understand that some of the things that we've allowed or that have happened to us weren't actually our fucking fault. Even though at the time we blamed ourselves. Even though maybe those of you watching today or listening today are blaming yourself right now. The anger that will come from that is perfectly natural. The anger that will come from the realization that what has happened to you was not your fault. Yes, it is hard. It's very hard because you don't trust and because you have that fear, and also because whatever little grasping straws you can find of control, you're going to gravitate to that and try to grab onto that. Similarly, with other people controlling you or trying to, like your mom or other close, what I call COI people, circle of influence people, in the beginning of practicing your boundaries, you do not want to practice your boundaries with the boss fight. You want to practice your boundaries in small places, small areas, to build up the muscle of saying no. You have a lot of anger, and depression comes, especially for many men, from being sad. But sad wasn't allowed, so you learned as a child, well, anger's allowed, sad not so much, right? And so you don't accept that part of yourself. Yeah, you can be like that with women, but then it becomes a control thing, or it can become that way. Until you work through the sadness part and actually expressing that in a place that you feel safe to do so, and you haven't felt safe, totally relatable for the reasons I just read, until you are able to get to that point, you're not going to be able to stop the associated behaviors and thoughts that you have from these early times that leads you to the places where you are unhappy in. Jerry had been physically abused by both of his parents for years. He had left home early, joined the Marines, and had several bad marriages. In therapy as an adult in his 30s, he began realizing why. Under his tough exterior, Jerry always longed for controlling women. He'd fall madly in love with the fact that they could quote-unquote handle him. Then a pattern of compliance to the woman would emerge later, with Jerry on the losing end. One day in session, Jerry remembered his mother striking him across the face for some small infraction. He vividly remembered his vain attempts to protect himself as a child, pleading, "Please, Mom, I'm sorry. I'll do anything you say. Please, Mom." When he promised unquestioning obedience, the hitting would stop for Jerry. That memory tied in with his lack of power and self-control with his wives and his girlfriends. After I just repeated to you guys before, can you tell the pattern here? Why Jerry would even have wives and girlfriends that he has that dynamic with? Especially since you are males, you guys can maybe relate to this. Okay, too much relation? Okay, yeah. We can see a little bit of ourselves in Jerry, can't we? Yes, exactly, Jesse. Subconsciously, though, but you have to recognize that attempt to reverse what happened in childhood or get control back, that is a subconscious thing. That's not conscious. Until we come to the awareness of what has happened. And this is why I think therapy is such a great thing, because therapy allows you to go back to that time, to speak about that time, talk about that trauma. Of course, you have to lead your therapist there, right? Therapists are not fucking mind readers. They don't know what we need therapy on. So they ask us a lot of questions, often like I did with you guys when I first met you, and then they determine, okay, maybe this is an area for therapy, right? No one can read our minds. They don't know what we need therapy on. But by reading something like this and going through this book together, we can determine, oh, I have an issue there. I actually have been subconsciously trying to get some reversal of what happened there. I have been trying to fix my mom, in all these other relationships, right? Or in my case, my dad, right? Because that applies with me to a male. And I'll read that again. When he promised unquestioning obedience, the hitting would stop. That memory tied in with his lack of power and self-control with his wives and his girlfriends. Their anger always terrified Jerry, and he would instantly comply. Jerry's boundary development was seriously injured by his mother's abuse. The heart of God seems to beat especially close to victims of trauma. In the Bible, Isaiah says, "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted." God desires the wounds of the traumatized to be bound up by loving people. Victims of trauma in the family are almost always recipients of poor or sinful character-relating problems. Withdrawal from our boundaries and hostility toward our boundaries are the ground from which trauma springs. And this is the last part. Thank you for all of you who have stayed for this entire meeting today. Our own character traits. Have you ever heard someone described as being, quote-unquote, that way from the womb? Perhaps you were always active and confrontive, always exploring new horizons. Or maybe you liked to be quiet and reflective, quote-unquote, since forever. We contribute our boundary issues by our own individual character styles. For example, some people with a constitutionally greater amount of aggression deal with boundary problems more confrontationally, and some with less aggression might shy more from boundaries. Our own sinfulness. We also can contribute to our own boundary development problems by our own depravity. Depravity is what we have inherited from Adam and Eve. It is our resistance to being creatures under God, our resistance to humility. It's a refusal to accept a position and a lust for being omnipotent and in charge, not needing anyone and not being accountable to anyone. Our depravity, though, enslaves us to the law of sin and death, from which only Christ can save us, Romans 8:2. But by now, you should be gaining a much clearer picture of what goes into boundary problems and boundary development. It's time now to look at what the Bible says about how boundaries should operate in our lives and how they can be developed all through our lives. And that's chapter 5. It's called the 10 Laws of Boundaries. You guys may or may not have heard about the laws of success, the laws of etc. I think it's laws of success. These are very similar to the laws of success, but they have to do with boundaries. success in boundaries. And we did touch on consequences. If you guys have any questions regarding consequences, and what we will learn more about how to use those in the future, I'm happy to share that. As well, we touched on the different types, ways that boundaries are developed. If you guys want to read that for yourselves, I will be posting that in the Discord. Yeah, and if you guys want to speak amongst yourselves, I will try to fix my speakers really quickly so that I can hear you guys. And I just want to thank you for, you may have missed it, but can you tell me the title of this book? Yes, the title of this book is called Boundaries. When to say yes, when to say no, to take control of your life. Because oftentimes we make choices subconsciously and we're not in control. We think we are, but we don't actually make choices from a place of control. We make them from a subconscious place. Sometimes our inner child is making the choices, like with people who we're attracted to. I wouldn't say it's 90%. It might be 90% for you right now, but it won't always be 90%. I promise you that. The more you learn and the more aware you become of why you do the things you do, why you're making the choices that you're making now based on the choices you've made before, these kinds of things, it will free you from just, willy-nilly living your life and thinking that, all these things is because of you or revolves around you, or bad things that happen to you are somehow your fault. All of that will be removed. You will no longer be living your life in that way. And you will actively make choices. And you will cause other people to actively make choices as well. It's kind of amazing. And I really want that. I really, really want that for you guys. That kind of freedom, there's no price. There's no price on that kind of freedom. Like I said, and I know I probably sound like a broken record, but learning these things, and I did not believe in God, when I learned them or when I practiced them. Learning these things and applying them has changed my entire life. The course of my life, the types of choices that I made, the types of people I was attracted to, so many things. And I know that the circle can be completed with you guys, especially since you're willing to do the work that it takes of going back to those hard places, reliving those painful times, and yet looking at them and re-examining them with new eyes. Not a lot of people are willing to do that, and I commend you guys. I think you guys are amazing for doing that. And I know how hard that is because I have done it. And it was really fucking hard. And I did it by myself. I don't want you guys to do it by yourselves. I don't want you guys to have to be alone to do it. And if you don't trust women, cool, I get that. You can do it with other men. There's other ways, to get to where you're going. It doesn't necessarily even have to be with me. That's why, well, there's probably a deep-seated reason for that, Mr. J. If you don't trust men and women, there's a reason for that. And I would say to look into finding out why that is and where that comes from. Because little by little, if you understand where that comes from, you then can work on that. And you can determine for yourself a new compass of what your trust will look like. I will trust you up to this point. After that, I don't trust fucking anybody, right? Or this is my point. This is my boundary. After this, I no longer trust. But the difference is your inner child setting that boundary subconsciously from childhood, where you don't trust anyone, you don't trust anything, you're not safe anywhere, and your adult mind choosing where that line is. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's huge. It's a huge difference. And if you are 90 years old and you never get to the place where you trust everyone, that's fine. You don't have to. But it's your choice. And you'll have taken that choice into your own hands, as opposed to being, blown about by the wind, as we read. Or just accepting, this happened and this is, I don't control this. And then the things that you get depressed about, relating back deeply to your original hurts, they won't have as strong of an effect as your original hurts as they do now, where you're literally linking them together. People have certain difficulties in relationships with getting over relationships and breakups because of those original pains. People attach that original pain or that original abandonment or that original neglect, invalidation from parents to the mate, and then becomes the ex-mate, right? They attach those things, those feelings, and so that's why it's so painful. But when they come to the point of recognizing, well, I'm not really hurting about this person. I'm actually hurting because this situation reminds me of my childhood trauma. Does that make sense? Yes, it is painful that we have breakups, don't get me wrong. But the breakup is a reinforcement feeling that happens with an earlier trauma. Not for everyone, because some people have breakups and they let go and it's fine. They don't have terrible Not everybody has terrible breakups. Children who have suffered some trauma have much more difficult breakups, and the idea of breaking up itself is like death. The reason is there's an attachment to that earlier trauma. Yeah, I think that was clearer. But this is the conclusion of our meeting, and those who were unable to attend, I have recorded this for you. I hope that you will give a listen to it and that it will open up some new perceptions for you, new perspectives that maybe you weren't thinking of, and pass it on. If you've learned anything from this, please clip it so that you can always remember it. We are creatures who forget things pretty easily, but if we have something to go back to and to remember something, it always helps us. So I strongly recommend clipping whatever portion spoke to you. And again, the name of the book that I'm reading from in my workshop, in my Discord workshop, is called Boundaries. When to say yes, when to say no, to take control of your life. Thanks for watching and listening. Have a great day.